Hi, this is Kristen, aka the Flow Physicist, and this is my cut video from my grid tech exploration class for Campfire 2020. So first, we talked about doing translations in our regular cross grid. They're even more interesting if we do them from quarter time, because you can make some nice shapes. This is how to move around the grid without any rotation of your hand. If you are rotating, but not actually moving your hand around the grid, this is a static spin, which you can either do with the elbow pass like I just did, or with finger spinning. And you'll notice that the staff stops vertically, horizontally, vertically, horizontally. We also went over extensions, which are when you have your hand going around the grid the same way your wrist is turning. So you have this effect where you're isolating the point. And then the anti-spin, where your wrist is rotating the opposite direction you're going around. So this makes like a pushing motion of the one that's facing the center of the grid up to whatever grid point you're moving to. We also talked about some timing and directions, some basic VTG. So for this, we have hands together, same direction, hands together going in the opposite direction, same direction, hands are split, and then opposite direction with hands split. We went over some basic grid tech things with these ideas. So if you do a static spin versus a translation, that's your sluice gate. And we also went over an idea such as the translation versus extension, which has you making a T-shape at the sides and then together at the top and bottom. We went over the idea of body-centered grids. So if these have the point of the grid as the reference, the body-centered grid looks instead at one of the squares that is intersecting that point. The extension with your wrist rotating the same direction as you're going looks like this fishy. And the anti-spin, the wrist is the opposite direction you're going, ends up having you isolate each of the points you're rotating about, like you're opening and closing a book. So with this, I talked about the analogousness, namely that the point-centered grid and extension there could also be an anti-spin of the adjacent, box or body-centered grid. And an anti-spin in the point-centered grid could actually be an extension in the adjacent body-centered grid. Now that we've defined extensions and anti-spins in the body-centered grid, we can do VTG stuff with those as well, such as this hands together, opposite direction anti-spin. Or I also like to do the split same extensions, which you can add a turn in if the pass seems like it's going to be too hard. We talked about some grid hybrids you can do with these two grids, namely if you have your staffs in a cross motion, how you're going to have one that can be in the body-centered grid and the other one can be in the point-centered grid. And as long as you're talking about the same grid center, notice that the center of both these grids is where the point center is. You can actually do different timings and directions with that. So we have our together same, together opposite, split same, and split up. I also talked about these two grids, but in diamond mode. So if you take your grid and you rotate it 45 degrees, in the point center grid, you're now dealing with a cross. So we did this kind of fun move, the translate then extension. You can also do anti-spins in this grid. It's the same as the other grid, but just rotated. And we can also do the same thing for the diamonds, the body-centered diamonds that they intersect. So you have your anti-spin and your extension. Note that you can do VTG in all of these. And then finally, the last grid hybrid I talked about was doing the hybrid of the point-centered square and the point-centered diamond grids. So this reminds you of that one fan move you see where people do the 8 petals. So this one will be in the diamond, this one will be in the box. If we do alternating anti-spins, you get this cool pedal effect. I also briefly mentioned the idea that you can do the body-centered grids with head tracers, kind of like you're scratching your back with this extension, and also as body tracers. So I think it's nice from the reels to kind of stop, and then you can make yourself a body-centered grid to rotate about before perhaps continuing. Thank you for tuning in to my class. Please contact me at FlowPhysicist on Instagram if you have any more questions.